Let me say up front that these are my opinions and I don't speak for the Defense Department. What I've been seeing in the military during the past year specifically has been what I'll call the hyper-politicization of our military forces in our diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings. And I've recognized in those trainings both the vocabulary and the narratives of the Marxist revolutionary impulse, is what I'll call it. And I'm also seeing a double standard at play. And what I mean by that is that it seems that people are allowed to, service members are allowed to advocate for the revolutionary agenda, narrative, and cause, but to either disagree with talking points or ideas or to point out the partisanship is to have a finger wagged back at you and to be accused of being politically partisan. Our service members are trained that they're supposed to be apolitical, and for good reason. And yet every aspect of their lives at the moment is becoming politicized. I spoke up and said, we need to remove the politics from our military environment. And I was relieved of my command for being politically partisan. And so where does that leave our young service members right now who are supposed to be apolitical, but yet want to retain their beliefs, values, and be able to speak freely?
Almost 3 months ago, you were relieved of your command in the Space Force after you wrote your book, Irresistible Revolution. And so I guess before we talk about the book, which I've really enjoyed reading, where are things now for you?
Yeah, first I'll say up front, I am still active duty, though I'm on terminal leave. And terminal leave means I'm separating from the service, and my last day in the service is 1 September. Where things stand for us at the moment is that for the past 3 months, we've heard that there was an alleged investigation that was ongoing in the Pentagon, but I've not had any communication about that, either from my chain of command or from the Air Force Inspector General's office, who is the one that I think was to be conducting an investigation. And so I wrote a letter to then acting Secretary of the Air Force, explaining certain circumstances which I don't plan to make public, but also requesting an early retirement and a separation honorably from the service. And they've denied me an early retirement, but agreed that they would separate me. And so my family and I have decided that that's the best course of action for us right now, given the circumstances. I've sometimes, whether you want to call it tongue-in-cheek or not, just said I was fired, or you've seen it show up in that way. And some people had presumed that that meant I was no longer in the service, or that I'd been kicked out of the military, and that wasn't true either. So I was in command of a space-based missile warning unit in Colorado. And at the time that I published the book and spoke about it publicly on a podcast, my chain of command deemed my behavior politically partisan in nature. And that was the allegation at the time that I was relieved of my command of the space-based missile warning unit. Now, I was still a lieutenant colonel on active duty in the Space Force from that day on. But the day that I was relieved of command on the phone, the general officer who had relieved me of command asserted that it was because I was politically partisan while acting in an official capacity, which I've always denied, that I was relieved of command. And then the investigation was open to determine whether or not I was actually politically partisan while acting in an official capacity, which seems ironic because perhaps it is. And so I never did hear an outcome from that investigation. And I read in the news, whether it was several days later or a week later, that that investigation had been stood down by the Department of the Air Force, and that the Department of the Air Force's Inspector General office, the highest level complaints office in the Department of the Air Force, had opened their own investigation into these issues or these matters. And it was about that vague. And so whether it was me or a whole host of people that were a part of that investigation, I just can't pretend to say, and I still don't know and haven't heard. But in case there are some viewers or listeners that would be quick to think I'm just some disgruntled service member who decided this was my issue I was going to pick a fight over, they'd be wrong. I had attempted, before ever writing a book, to use my chain of command and the internal mechanisms available to every service member for these kinds of complaints for many months before I ever put pen to paper and began writing what became Irresistible Revolution. I had used every member of my chain of command, in fact, to the very top. I'd had both in-person and phone conversations with them about some of what I was seeing, expressing my concern that it was dividing our force. And then I filed a formal Inspector General's office complaint in writing, a 7-page memo that happened to go to the same 3-star general that ended up later relieving me of my command duties. And they sat on that through the election cycle in November, December, and January, waiting for an outcome, it seemed to me, before they made an adjudication of my own complaint about the teaching of critical race theory at my base, which was in direct contravention of President Trump's executive order at the time banning such trainings in federal agencies. And so I felt nearly no other option other than to write a book and discuss the issues publicly so that we could invite many people into the discussion.
So you mentioned diversity, equity, and inclusion being, a theme that's taught extensively in the military now. This doesn't seem to many to be problematic. It seems, in fact, to be quite laudable. What's the issue with this?
It can seem like a laudable goal. The issue, I think, was well stated by Carol Swain, who recently and several times has said that the diversity, equity, and inclusion industry is steeped in critical race theory, which is rooted in Marxist ideology, and that's 100% correct. The trouble with that is Marxist ideology, and a particular aspect of Marxist ideology that I focus on in both my writings and in understanding this issue, is the oppressor versus the oppressed narrative that is developed by Marx and Engels in their 1848 Communist Manifesto. When you start to lump people either into economic class stratifications or into race identity groups and insist that one group, by virtue of their identity, is inherently an oppressor, and in our race dialogue discussions, that is the white group, and in another group, based on their racial identity, is an oppressed and victimized group of people, then you start to breed division and animosity among and between those groups of people and breed distrust. Now, critical race theory does exactly what I've just described. It has capitalized on race essentialism and race division in our dialogue and redefined terms that are a large part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion industry. And their redefined terms and vocabulary are now showing up in our military training sessions. Instead of unifying people and helping us solve some of the problems or issues we're currently facing, it actually plants new ones, and it causes greater division. And I've seen that as an active duty service member. I've seen it as a commander in our armed forces.